Good evening, all, and welcome back to Dark Fears. Tonight, we journey into the frozen heart of Alaska, through forgotten corners and isolated small towns buried beneath endless wilderness, places where help does not reach. Here, 7 of the most disturbing, real, and terrifying true horror stories have emerged, accounts that will make you question what survives beyond the last road. These are not legends or campfire tales. These are real, documented encounters from ordinary people. From abandoned Alaskan homes to things watching from the tree line. From basements hiding secrets to disappearances that defy explanation. Tonight, you will hear horrors that refuse to stay buried. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Dark Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of Alaska, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Ethan Rowe, and this happened when I was 26, during my first winter working maintenance in a small Alaskan town called Coldwater. I took the job because I needed money, and because the town promised isolation, no noise, no people, no distractions. That was the lie I told myself. Coldwater sat between endless trees and a frozen river that never fully thawed. Fewer than 300 people lived there, and everyone watched everyone else. The locals had one unspoken rule: don't go outside after midnight unless you absolutely have to. No one explained why. They just stared until you nodded. My job was simple: fix generators, check heating lines, respond to emergency calls. On my 3rd night, I heard something strange while locking up the utility shed. A soft, uneven whistling drifting from the forest. It wasn't a tune. It sounded like someone trying and failing to remember one. I stood there longer than I should have, listening until the whistling stopped. Then behind me, something whistled again. Closer. The next morning, I asked Mara, the woman who ran the only diner, if people whistled out in the woods. Her smile disappeared so fast, it felt rehearsed. She poured my coffee, leaned in, and said, "If you hear it, no, you didn't." Over the next week, the whistling followed a pattern. Always after midnight, always near the edge of the tree line. Sometimes it sounded closer to town, like it was learning the roads. The worst part wasn't the sound, it was the pauses. Long, thoughtful silences, as if whoever was whistling was listening for a response. One night, the power cut out near the old fish processing plant. Protocol said I had to check it. The radio crackled as I drove, and I noticed something odd in my headlights. Footprints in the snow, barefoot, too long to be human, leading toward the trees. Then the whistling started again. This time, it came from behind me, perfectly copying the sound of my own shaky breath. I reversed the truck so fast the tires screamed against the ice. The radio burst into static, then a voice slipped through, my own voice, calmly saying my name. I shut it off and drove back to town without fixing the outage. No one questioned me. In Coldwater, unfinished jobs were sometimes considered survival. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whistling returned, drifting between buildings now, threading itself through alleyways like smoke. I peeked through my frost-coated window and saw a figure standing under the street lamp across the road. Tall, too thin, its shoulders bent forward as if the cold didn't bother it at all. It raised its head slowly, and the whistling stopped. I realized then, the sound wasn't coming from its mouth. It came from its throat, wet and strained, like air being forced through something not meant for it. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Don't answer it. Behind me, inside my apartment, something whistled back. I locked myself in the bathroom until morning. When daylight finally came, 3 people were missing. No alarms, no signs of struggle. Just empty beds and doors left slightly open, as if they had stepped outside willingly. The town held an unspoken meeting at the diner. No police, no calls for help. An old man named Harlan finally spoke. He said the whistling man only comes when the town grows too loud, too curious, too confident. He imitates, he learns. And when someone answers him, even by accident, he follows the sound home. That explained the radio, the message, the way it copied my breathing. That night, the whistling circled my building again. Slower this time, patient. I sat in total darkness, holding my breath until my chest burned. The sound stopped right outside my door. Then came 3 soft knocks. Perfectly timed, perfectly human. I never opened that door. By morning, Coldwater had 1 less apartment and 1 more empty space where a man used to live. I tried to leave Coldwater the next day. I packed only what I could carry and drove toward the highway before sunrise. 10 miles out, my truck stalled near the frozen river. The engine was fine. The fuel line was clear. It was as if the vehicle had simply decided it wasn't going any farther. That's when I heard it again. The whistling floated across the ice, echoing unnaturally, bending direction. It didn't sound distant anymore. It sounded amused. On the riverbank, I saw movement. A shape standing where the ice thinned, bare feet planted on frozen water that should not have held its weight. Its head tilted, listening, waiting for something from me. I backed away slowly, but the snow behind me crunched in a second rhythm. Another whistle joined the first, slightly off-key, like an echo learning to exist on its own. That's when I understood the truth Coldwater never said aloud. It wasn't one thing, it was many. And they didn't stop you from leaving by force. They waited until you chose to stay. I made it back to town on foot just as the sun rose. No one asked where I'd gone. They never do. I resigned that morning, packed my things again. This time, I waited until midday to leave. As I crossed the town limit sign, the whistling followed me. Faint, distant, almost disappointed. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe too loud. I didn't think about how the sound faded only after miles of road stretched between us. Months later, I read about Coldwater online. Population reduced, several unexplained disappearances. No official investigations, just silence. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet enough, I still hear it. A broken whistle drifting through the dark, practicing, improving. And when it happens, I remind myself of the rule I learned too late. Never answer sounds you didn't make. Never follow something that knows your voice. Because once it learns you, it never forgets. I thought leaving Alaska would end it. I moved south, took a job near a crowded city, surrounded myself with noise. Traffic, voices, music playing constantly. Silence had become my enemy. For a while, it worked. Weeks passed without the sound, months even. Then one night, during a power outage, everything went quiet at once. No hum of electricity, no distant sirens, just stillness. That's when I heard it. Faint, hesitant, like someone testing the air. A whistle, just one note slipping through the dark hallway of my apartment building. I froze. My neighbor's doors stayed shut. No footsteps, no reactions. The whistle repeated, closer now, stronger, more confident. My phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. No words, just an audio message. I didn't press play, I didn't have to. I could already hear my own breathing coming from the other side of the wall. Perfectly copied, perfectly calm. Whatever lived in cold water hadn't stayed there. It had followed the sound of me leaving. I learned how to survive it, not defeat it. I never answer unknown calls. I sleep with noise playing softly, just enough to break the silence. I don't whistle. I don't hum. I don't even talk to myself anymore. Some nights, though, the sound still leaks through. It comes from vents, from stairwells, from the spaces between walls where voices don't belong. Always practicing, always patient. I started researching other towns like Coldwater. Different names, same patterns, isolated places, disappearances, reports of strange sounds before people vanish. Whistling, clicking, breathing where no one stands. Coldwater wasn't cursed. It was a feeding ground, a place where the quiet was deep enough for things to learn us. If you live somewhere remote and hear a sound calling your attention, something familiar, something personal, don't respond. Don't investigate. Because some things don't hunt with teeth or claws. They hunt with imitation. And once they sound like you, they don't need to knock anymore. Last winter, I received a letter. No return address, no postage stamp. Just my name written in careful, uneven handwriting that looked practiced rather than natural. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words. We hear you now. That night, every sound in my apartment changed. The refrigerator hummed off-key. The pipes breathed instead of knocking. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, waiting for something else to begin. Then the whistling came. Not from one direction, but many. Above me, below me, inside the walls. Different pitches, different attempts, circling the same rhythm. They weren't calling anymore. They were communicating. I pressed my hands over my ears. But the sound didn't travel through air. It traveled through thought, through memory, through the parts of my mind that remembered being alone in cold water, listening too long. For the first time, I understood the truth. Leaving never mattered. Silence did. And silence always returns. I'm recording this now because speaking is safer than quiet. Words create edges. Silence creates doors. If this story sounds scattered, it's because the whistling gets closer whenever I pause too long. They're better now. Smoother. More accurate. Sometimes they sound exactly like the people I've lost. Other times, they sound like me. Confident, calm, inviting. That's the most dangerous version. Cold water still exists, even if maps forget it. And places like it will always exist, wherever the world thins out and people think being alone means being safe. If you ever hear a sound that feels like it knows you, don't answer. Don't listen. Don't wonder. Fill the air with anything else. Because the whistling man was never a man. It was a mirror. And mirrors don't chase you. They wait for you to look back. My name is Caleb Mercer, and this happened when I was 31. During the winter, I worked as a supply pilot for a coastal Alaskan town called Frosthaven. I flew medicine, mail, and food. Short hops over endless white nothing. I liked the job because the sky made sense. The ground didn't. Frosthaven sat between cliffs and sea ice, a town that glowed softly at night like it was afraid of the dark. The locals warned me about flying after sunset. Not storms, lights. They said strange lights appeared beneath the ice offshore, moving slowly, patiently, as if searching. I laughed the first time I heard it. Then, on my 5th night landing, I saw them. 3 pale blue lights pulsing under the frozen bay, far too deep and wide apart to be reflections. They moved together, stopping when my plane touched down, waiting. After I shut off the engine, every light beneath the ice went dark at once. The dock workers wouldn't meet my eyes. One of them whispered, They know your schedule now. That's when I realized Frosthaven wasn't afraid of the dark. It was afraid of what answered back. The next morning, I asked the harbor master, Lena, what the lights were. She didn't deny them. That scared me more than any explanation. She told me they'd been there longer than the town itself, appearing every winter when the ice grew thick enough to hold secrets. They don't like noise, she said. They like routines. Over the following days, I noticed patterns. The lights surfaced beneath the ice only when planes landed late, only when generators hummed low, only when the town settled into its quiet. They drifted closer to shore, inch by inch, night by night. One evening, I flew in late due to fog. As I circled the runway, my instruments flickered. The compass spun uselessly. Below me, through cracks in the ice, I saw the lights rising, brighter now, closer together, forming something like a shape. As I descended, the radio clicked on by itself. A voice came through, wet and echoing. "Lower," it said. I pulled up hard and barely cleared the cliffs. Behind me, the bay ice cracked for the first time all winter. After that flight, Frosthaven changed its rules. No landings after sunset, no exceptions. The town council didn't put it in writing, but everyone followed it. Everyone except emergencies. And emergencies, I learned, were rare on purpose. Lena showed me the old dock records one afternoon. Ships that vanished without wreckage. Planes that never radioed Mayday, all marked with the same note. Late arrival. The lights beneath the ice had been patient for decades, adjusting, waiting for mistakes. That night, I stayed awake at the airstrip office, watching the bay through binoculars. The ice was smooth and unbroken, but beneath it, the lights drifted like slow thoughts. They formed lines, then curves. For a moment, I could swear they were watching the sky, not the water. My radio crackled even though it was off. The same voice returned, clearer now. "You are early," it said. I shut the blinds and sat on the floor until morning. When I opened them again, there were handprints frozen into the ice. Far too large, pressed upward from below. 2 weeks later, a medical evacuation call came in after sunset. A child with severe hypothermia. No one else would fly. I told myself it was just lights, just fear fed by isolation. I told myself the sky had never lied to me before. As I took off, the bay lit up beneath me. Not 3 lights this time, dozens. They moved in perfect coordination, matching my altitude, my speed. The sea ice began to fracture, lines racing outward like veins. Mid-flight, my fuel gauge dropped to 0, then corrected itself. My altimeter spun. And through the cockpit glass, I saw a shape rising beneath the ice. A vast outline pressing upward, stretching the frozen surface thin. The radio turned on again. "We are ready now," the voice said. I diverted inland, climbing hard. The lights followed for miles before slowly sinking back into the bay, one by one, as if disappointed. I landed shaking, the child already transferred by ground team. Frosthaven had never needed me to fly. It needed me to arrive. After that night, I refused to fly after dark. I stayed in Frosthaven, working daytime deliveries only. But the lights didn't disappear. They drifted beneath the ice every evening, like restless eyes marking the rhythm of the town. Even from my cabin, I could see faint blue glows through the cracks in the frozen bay. One evening, I noticed movement in the snow along the shoreline. Figures or shadows that weren't human. They didn't walk. They glided just above the surface, limbs bending in impossible angles. When the lights below pulsed, the figures paused, perfectly still, listening. I tried to warn the townspeople. They didn't reply, didn't argue. Their eyes were distant, haunted. Lena finally whispered, They only show themselves to those who watch too much. That night, I stayed by the window, binoculars in hand. The lights swirled, forming vague humanoid shapes under the ice. Then one of the shadows on the shore mimicked my posture exactly, crouching beside the dock as I crouched to observe. It was learning. A week later, a storm hit. I couldn't leave by air or sea. The town huddled indoors as wind whipped snow into walls of white. I stayed near my window, eyes glued to the bay. The ice groaned and cracked in unnatural ways. Then the lights surfaced. Not beneath the ice this time, but on top of it. They pulsed in concentric circles around the dock, and the water near the edges steamed despite sub-zero temperatures. Figures emerged from the lights, rising from the frozen surface like twisted mannequins. I felt them studying me, calculating my reactions. I wanted to leave, but the storm had trapped me. Panic surged. I noticed one figure moving differently, closer, deliberate. It mimicked the way I gripped the binoculars, the way I breathed. I remembered Lena's words. They like routines. They weren't just lights or shadows. They were aware, and whatever had learned me was hungry for repetition. The next day, the storm cleared, but the bay had changed. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ice, glowing faintly with residual blue light. I went to the docks to inspect. Nothing was left, no figures, no footprints, just ice that seemed wounded, as if it remembered what had walked on it. That evening, I received a call from my flight coordinator. He was confused. My plane, parked securely in the hangar, showed signs of having flown a short distance. Engines warm, instruments powered. No log, no pilot, no explanation. I stared at the phone and felt a pulse of cold run through my veins. The lights had learned more than just my schedule. They had learned the planes. Later that night, I watched from my cabin as the ice lit up again. Lines of blue spread in deliberate formations, connecting cracks, forming strange, geometric patterns. I realized with dread that the lights weren't random. They were mapping, not just observing. And I had become part of their blueprint. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't leave. Frosthaven had me. I tried talking to Lena again. She admitted that pilots had vanished in the past, late arrivals, or those who ignored warnings. She said no one who saw the lights at close range returned unchanged. That night, I ventured closer to the bay, against my better judgment. The ice groaned beneath my weight, and the lights flickered as if sensing me. I saw shapes moving beneath the surface. Vague, humanoid, sometimes humanoid but too tall, too thin, limbs bending like they weren't bound by anatomy. Then one figure surfaced fully, slowly, deliberately. Its form glowed faintly blue from within, semi-transparent, revealing only hints of skeletal structure and elongated features. It raised a hand toward me, mirroring my own trembling grip on the binoculars. I stumbled back, nearly falling through a crack, and the lights sank. Silence returned, but I knew it wasn't gone. Frosthaven wasn't a town. It was a waiting room, and the lights were its attendants, patient and eternal. Days later, I received a package with no return address. Inside, a small piece of cracked ice from the bay, glowing faintly blue even in my warm cabin. A note accompanied it. "We remember your shape." I understood then that the lights weren't merely environmental anomalies. They were sentient, cataloging everyone and everything that disturbed their routines. Even now, miles away from Frosthaven, I could feel their presence in every reflective surface, every pool of water, every shadow at night. I started seeing subtle movements, shapes flickering beneath frozen puddles, faint blue glows beneath city ice patches after winter storms. It didn't matter where I went. They were connected to me now, mapping me, learning me, waiting for my mistakes. And the more I tried to forget, the more precise they became. I stopped flying entirely. I stopped leaving my apartment after dark. I stopped trusting the quiet. Because the moment you rely on silence, the lights beneath Frosthaven find you first. I record this now as a warning. The lights will adapt. They will learn your routines, your voice, even your reflections. Frosthaven is not a town. It is a collection point, a testing ground for things that wait patiently beneath the ice. I tried moving far south, but the strange flickers haunt me in every frozen surface, every snowstorm, every night that stretches too long. I speak little, I travel little, and I avoid any calm or quiet. If you ever fly over icy waters at night in Alaska or see lights glowing beneath frozen surfaces, do not be curious. Do not approach. Do not try to map them or name them. They are far older and far more patient than you can imagine. Because they don't just observe. They remember, and eventually, they follow. And once they know your shape, they will wait. Forever. My name is Sophie Lang, and this happened when I was 24, hiking alone in a remote Alaskan forest called Raven's Hollow. I had always loved the wilderness, the smell of pine, the crunch of frozen leaves, the way snow muffled sound into a soft, otherworldly silence. That winter, I thought I could handle the isolation. Raven's Hollow was notorious among locals. A trail that vanished mid-forest, trees twisted unnaturally, footprints that didn't match any animal known to the region. I dismissed the warnings as superstition until the first night. I had set up camp near a frozen creek, stove going, journal out. That's when I heard the whispers. Soft, echoing voices carried on the wind. Not human, not animal. Just syllables I couldn't place, repeating like a mantra. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the tree line. Nothing. Just darkness, snow, and the occasional creak of ice-laden branches. Yet the whispers continued, moving closer, circling my tent, shaping themselves into something I felt but couldn't see. I realized then, Raven's Hollow doesn't let people wander alone. It waits. I tried to ignore it, telling myself the wind carried my imagination. But the whispers persisted, sometimes matching the sound of my own voice as I muttered to myself. It was unnerving, almost intelligent. The next day, I decided to follow the trail marked on my map. Soon, I noticed the markers, the old wooden signs, vanished. I had passed them moments before. The path became uncertain, snow covering footprints that I was sure I had left behind. My own trail was disappearing, as if the forest were erasing me. By nightfall, I was disoriented. I set up camp again, but the whispers returned with renewed intensity. This time, they formed a pattern. 3 distinct tones repeated in a slow, deliberate sequence. I recognized it from a story told by a local ranger. Hikers who heard the 3-tone pattern never returned the same, or at all. I stayed awake all night, clutching my knife, listening as the shadows seemed to shift around the edges of my tent. Something was following me. By dawn, the whispers had faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. I stepped outside the tent, hoping to reorient myself. The trail, which had seemed so familiar the day before, had shifted overnight. Trees I remembered passing were gone. Rocks I had marked with chalk were missing. Even the frozen creek had changed course slightly, as if the forest itself were alive, reshaping around me. I tried to follow the compass, but it spun erratically. Every direction seemed identical. Twisted trees, snow-laden branches, shadows that stretched impossibly long. My footsteps left impressions for only a few moments before disappearing entirely. That afternoon, I saw it. A dark figure crouched between two trees, watching me silently. It was humanoid but impossibly tall and thin, limbs bending at unnatural angles. I froze. It didn't move as I approached, yet it didn't retreat either. I backed away slowly, remembering the ranger's warning. Never stare too long. They remember. Somehow, I realized this forest wasn't just hiding me. It was learning me. Night fell faster than I expected. The temperature plummeted, and the forest seemed to close in on me. The shadows moved independently of the moonlight. I heard soft footsteps circling my tent, crunching in the snow just outside. I didn't dare look directly, but I could feel them watching. The whispers returned, this time forming words. My name repeated over and over, each syllable dragging like frozen rope through the air. I tried shouting, but my voice seemed absorbed by the trees. My breath turned to frost before my eyes. I realized then that staying put was as dangerous as moving. Every path I considered seemed wrong. Even my previous tracks were gone, swallowed by snow or something far more sinister. I remembered the old ranger's final warning. They don't take you immediately. They make you wander, and the longer you stay, the more they know you. And the more you see, the less you will escape. That night, Raven's Hollow claimed my direction. By the fifth day, exhaustion had taken over. My legs ached, my fingers were numb, and my sense of time had fractured. Every direction looked identical, as if the forest had multiplied itself. The whispers were constant now, following me from tree to tree, repeating my movements, my breathing, even the way I tripped over roots. I stumbled across a frozen pond I was certain hadn't been there before. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, reflecting the twisted shapes of trees that didn't exist in my memory. And in that reflection, I saw others. Figures crouching at the edges, watching me. They weren't just shadows. They were conscious, moving deliberately, always on the edge of perception. Desperation pushed me forward. I marked trees with red tape to trace my steps, but the tape disappeared overnight. The forest was teaching me a cruel lesson. Nothing you leave behind remains. By evening, I found an old ranger cabin. It looked abandoned. But inside, I saw footprints leading back into the woods. Fresh, unnaturally long, and far too wide. The hollow was hungry. That night, I hid inside the cabin, barricading the door with broken furniture. The whispers became voices I knew. Friends, family, even strangers whose names I had only seen in passing. Each one called my name, pleading, warning, mocking. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound penetrated anyway. It came from the walls, the floor, even beneath the snow outside. The cabin shook slightly, though the wind was calm. I realized they weren't attacking me physically. They were testing me, learning me, predicting my next move. I thought about fleeing, but every exit seemed wrong. Snow drifted unnaturally, blocking paths I had walked hours before. The forest had rewritten itself. Even the stars outside seemed shifted, unfamiliar constellations pointing toward unknown directions. By midnight, I accepted a terrifying truth. Raven's Hollow didn't let you leave simply because you wanted to. It decided when and how, if ever. And the longer you stayed, the more it remembered. By the seventh day, I had stopped trying to keep track of time. Hunger gnawed at me, but the forest seemed to feed on my panic more than my body. Every path I tried led me back to the same frozen pond, the same twisted trees, the same shadows waiting. One night, I saw movement in the snow outside my cabin. A single figure, impossibly tall and thin, slowly walking on the surface, leaving footprints that shimmered faintly blue, as if frozen light had collected in them. It stopped when I blinked, then vanished in an instant. The whispers were relentless now, repeating my exact thoughts in my own voice. I realized they were not just observing. They were mirroring me, studying me, becoming me. I tried shouting at the shadows, but the sound bounced back differently, like an echo warped by the forest itself. By the time dawn arrived, I understood the forest's cruel design. The hollow didn't merely take. It molded its prey, bending reality around you until there was no escape, only reflection. I stumbled across a series of frozen, broken signposts marking the trail, each pointing in conflicting directions. Some signs were new, others rotted, all rearranged unnaturally. Every attempt to follow them brought me deeper into the hollow, further from any exit I could remember. The whispers turned urgent. My name was shouted repeatedly, interwoven with words I didn't understand. They weren't just sounds. They were commands, bending my instincts, compelling me to turn left, right, back in endless loops. I caught glimpses of the shadows at the edges of my vision, stretching, crouching, sometimes standing perfectly still, sometimes gliding across snow with impossible speed. They mirrored my movements, learning to anticipate my steps before I made them. When I finally stopped to rest, I realized I had lost all landmarks. Every tree, every rock, every frozen stream could no longer guide me. The forest itself had become a living maze, its walls shifting silently, bending my perception. I had become part of Raven's Hollow, and it was patient. By the 9th day, I had stopped thinking about leaving. The forest had rewritten all my bearings, my memories, my sense of self. Every sound I heard, branches snapping, snow crunching, was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the hollow. I stumbled across a frozen clearing I didn't recognize. The trees surrounding it were warped unnaturally, their branches twisting toward the center like claws. In the middle, faint footprints glowed blue in the snow, my footprints, but older, as if I had walked this clearing before, though I knew I hadn't. The whispers had changed too. They now repeated my deepest fears, my regrets, everything I had tried to ignore. I realized they weren't just watching. They were knowing, shaping me into something the hollow could understand, something it could hold. That night, the shadows rose from the tree line, gliding closer. They didn't run. They didn't chase. They just waited, teaching me patience I never wanted to have. The hollow didn't hurry. It never did. On the 10th day, I finally accepted the truth. Raven's Hollow doesn't lose track of you because you wander. It loses interest only when it's satisfied. I stepped into the clearing one last time, following the glowing footprints that mirrored my own. The whispers surrounded me, repeating my name in unending layers, merging with my own thoughts. My reflection in a frozen pond showed more than me, a taller, thinner version with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. I realized then that the hollow had copied me, created an echo of myself to understand how I moved, how I thought, how I feared. It didn't need to harm me physically. The forest itself had become my prison. Every step I took, every turn I made was now predicted, cataloged, owned. I left Raven's Hollow physically intact, but a part of me remained, trapped in snow, trees, and shadows, wandering the trails I could no longer distinguish. And somewhere in the distance, the whispers still call my name, patient and eternal. My name is Derek Harris, and this happened during the winter I worked at an abandoned gold mine in Black Ridge, Alaska. The mine had been closed for decades after a series of unexplained deaths. Locals whispered about strange echoes that bounced from the tunnels, carrying voices that weren't human or alive. I didn't believe them. I thought I understood darkness. I arrived at the mine one evening with a small team tasked with clearing out old equipment. The first thing that hit me was the cold, not the freezing winter air outside, but the kind that sucked warmth from your bones. My flashlight barely pierced the black corridors, and the walls seemed to absorb sound. Every step echoed unnaturally, sometimes repeating back words I hadn't spoken. By the time I reached the first tunnel, I heard faint whispering from deep within. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I recognized the voices. They were mine. Speaking thoughts I hadn't yet formulated, questions I hadn't asked. That was when I realized Black Ridge Mine didn't just echo sound, it echoed souls. The deeper we went, the colder it became. The beams of our flashlights seemed swallowed by darkness, and the echoes grew more distinct. They weren't random. Voices from past miners, some frightened, some screaming, some laughing. But occasionally, I heard my own voice answering them. We set up temporary lights in a main shaft, but even under their glow, the shadows seemed alive. Shapes shifted just beyond vision, sometimes flitting along walls, sometimes standing at the far end of the tunnels, watching silently. My team began to whisper about feeling followed, even when we were the only ones moving. I tried rationalizing it. Air currents, reflections, nerves. But nothing explained the repetition. If I whispered a single word, I could hear it repeated back after a long, deliberate pause, slightly altered, almost mocking. By the third hour inside the mine, one of the junior miners vanished. No scream, no sound, just gone. Only his helmet remained, spinning slowly on the icy ground, as if marking where he had once stood. The mine was alive, and it had started playing with us. We searched the tunnels frantically, calling his name, our voices swallowed by the walls. Every corner we turned, the echoes returned. Not our words, but fragments of his last movements. Footsteps we didn't make, whispers we didn't speak, noises that didn't belong to the living. I noticed that the ice on the floor reflected shapes that weren't ours, shadows stretching in unnatural ways, bending at impossible angles, moving independently. The walls themselves seemed to shift subtly, as if the mine was reconfiguring itself around us. Then I heard a different echo, one that made my stomach drop. My own voice, calm and steady, answering questions I hadn't yet asked. "Where is he?" it whispered. "He isn't lost, yet." The team froze. Their flashlights shook. I realized the mine wasn't just echoing sounds, it was learning us, predicting our fears, amplifying our doubts, turning every step into a trap. That night, I understood. Surviving Black Ridge Mine wasn't about strength or skill. It was about whether the mine decided you could leave. By the next hour, panic set in. Every tunnel looked identical. Every turn led to the same spot where the helmet had spun. The air grew colder, almost painful, and my breath formed icy clouds that lingered unnaturally long. The echoes weren't just sounds now. They were tangible, pressing against my eardrums, vibrating through the floor, as if the mine itself were speaking through me. We found scratch marks along the walls, deep, jagged lines that hadn't been there before. They appeared in patterns, almost like a language I couldn't read. I realized the mine was communicating, slowly, deliberately, letting us know it was aware of our presence. Then I heard it clearly, my own voice, calling my team's names in a distorted tone, warning them, teasing them, instructing them. one of my colleagues screamed and vanished mid-step, leaving nothing behind but a faint, icy outline where he had stood. It dawned on me. In Black Ridge Mine, the echoes weren't passive. They were hungry, and we had walked straight into them. By the 5th hour, we had split up, each of us trying to trace the mine's shifting passages. Every tunnel we entered seemed to fold in on itself, leading us back to where we had started. The echoes grew more vivid, now whispering threats and instructions I didn't understand, but instinctively obeyed. I reached a section of the mine I hadn't noticed on the maps. A narrow shaft descending sharply, walls glistening with fresh ice. At the bottom, faint footprints appeared, then vanished as soon as I stepped forward. The air hummed with whispers, growing louder, circling me, anticipating my movements. Then I saw a shadow flit across the wall. Tall, thin, elongated, and humanoid, but with limbs that bent in impossible ways. It stopped and turned, staring at me with featureless darkness where its face should have been. My blood ran cold as I realized it mimicked my every motion, predicting me, waiting for my mistakes. I backed away, almost slipping on the ice, and the mine seemed to breathe, closing in around me. Survival depended not on speed, but on patience, and I had none left. By the 6th hour, exhaustion and fear merged into a haze. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows danced more wildly, following the rhythm of my heart. The echoes were no longer passive. They answered me, responding to my whispered questions and thoughts before I finished them. I stumbled into a cavern larger than any I had seen before. The ceiling dripped with frozen water, creating icicles that glinted in the pale light. Figures emerged from the walls and floor, faintly luminous, humanoid, stretching impossibly tall, their faces featureless, reflecting my panic. I could hear my own voice calling me from different directions, luring me into corners, tricking me into following paths that didn't exist. The mine was no longer just alive. It was sentient, interacting with us, cataloging our reactions, testing our limits. One by one, I watched shadows approach the echoes of my missing teammates, merging with them in a shimmer of icy light. The mine didn't kill outright. It consumed their presence, their identities, leaving only shapes for me to see. I realized then, escaping wasn't optional. It was a challenge the mine might never let me win. By the 7th hour, I had stopped trying to reason. Every corridor led to another identical corridor. The echoes were no longer subtle. They shouted, mocking, questioning, mirroring my fear, twisting my words into commands. Each time I tried to step forward, shadows flitted just beyond the light, bending reality around me. I stumbled into a smaller tunnel, its walls slick with ice, and caught sight of something horrifying. The outlines of my team moving ahead of me, frozen mid-step, translucent, as if the mine had recorded them and was replaying them endlessly. Their eyes were hollow, reflecting nothing but the cavern's pale light. One figure turned, and I saw its face. It wasn't human. It was my own, elongated and distorted, mouth stretching unnaturally, eyes unnervingly blank. I staggered back, realizing that the mine didn't just echo voices. It copied them, twisted them, and waited for me to follow. I ran blindly, hoping the mine would let me go. But the echoes were patient, relentless, and everywhere. By the 8th hour, I was completely disoriented. Every path was a mirror of the last. Every step I took was predicted, echoed, or blocked by shadows that seemed alive. My voice called out, only to return altered, warped, repeating fears I hadn't dared speak aloud. I stumbled into a larger chamber, the walls covered in faint etchings, symbols I couldn't comprehend, glowing faintly blue, pulsating like the heartbeat of the mine itself. The echoes intensified, repeating my every movement, forming a rhythm that matched my pulse. I turned to leave and froze. Shadows were emerging from the walls, merging into shapes that resembled my missing colleagues, but twisted, faceless, and far taller than life. One reached toward me, mimicking the way I raised my flashlight, the tilt of my head, the way I trembled. I realized then that I was no longer in control. Black Ridge Mine didn't just trap you. It learned you, shaped you, and waited for you to falter. By the 9th hour, my mind was fraying. Every turn led to another frozen corridor, another echo of myself or my team. I could no longer trust my eyes, my ears, or even my memory. The mine had taken over all of them. I stumbled across a pool of frozen water in a cavern I didn't remember. Its surface shimmered, reflecting not my own image, but multiple versions of myself. Tall, thin, distorted, faceless, moving independently from my own motions. The echoes of my team swirled around them, forming a chorus of fear and despair. I tried to flee, but the shadows anticipated my steps. They moved before I could, blocking exits, pushing me toward deeper sections of the mine. The etchings on the walls pulsed brighter, synchronized with the whispers, almost as if the mine were breathing, aware of my panic. At that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. The mine didn't just trap bodies, it trapped souls, memories, and reflections, folding them into its icy architecture for eternity. By the 10th hour, I was alone, or at least physically alone. The shadows and echoes had consumed everything else. My own reflection in the icy pool stared back at me, taller, thinner, faceless, mirroring my exhaustion and fear. I understood then. I had survived physically, but Black Ridge Mine had already taken my essence. I staggered toward what I hoped was an exit, following faint signs of daylight, but every step felt rehearsed, as though the mine anticipated me. The echoes of my own voice called after me, repeating every word I spoke before I could form it. When I finally emerged into the cold Alaskan sunlight, the mine seemed inert again. Snow blanketed its entrance, shadows melted into silence, and the wind carried no whispers. But I knew better. Part of me remained inside, trapped with the echoes and shadows, cataloged by a sentient darkness that waits patiently for the next intruder. I left Black Ridge Mine physically alive, but a piece of me never returned. My name is Lucas Grayson, and this happened during a solo winter expedition near the Kinnick River in Alaska. I had spent years studying wolf packs and wilderness survival, thinking I could handle the isolation. I was wrong. The woods along the river were beautiful but unnervingly silent. Snow muffled every sound, and the wind carried a strange, almost musical howl. At first, I assumed it was wolves, or just the wind. But the tone was wrong. Deliberate, almost intelligent, weaving through the trees like it was communicating. On the first night, I set up camp near a frozen tributary. I thought I was alone, but faint footprints circled the perimeter of my tent. Too large for a wolf, too purposeful for a deer. Every time I shined my flashlight, they vanished. Then I heard them. Soft, guttural growls, layered over the howls. They didn't come from one direction. They came from everywhere. I realized that the Kinnick River woods didn't just house creatures. They lured and studied you. Something was waiting, and it knew I was alone. The following morning, I tried to trace the footprints, but the snow had already swallowed them. Every step I took felt watched, the howls now mimicking my own breathing, my movements, even my heartbeat. The woods weren't just inhabited. They were alive, responding to me. I followed the riverbank, hoping to reach a ranger station marked on my map. But the landscape seemed altered. Familiar landmarks disappeared, replaced by twisted versions of themselves. Trees leaned impossibly, branches entwined like grasping hands, and snowdrifts formed unnatural patterns, almost like warnings. As night fell again, the howls grew louder and closer. Shapes flitted at the edge of my vision. Tall, shadowy, humanoid, but with elongated limbs and fur that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. I realized they weren't wolves. They were something else, studying me, tracking me, waiting for me to slip. By the second night, I understood the terrifying rule of the Nick River woods. They didn't just hunt. They taught fear before the kill. By the third night, the howls had taken on a rhythm, almost musical, weaving through the trees in a way that felt purposeful. I could hear multiple sources, yet I could never pinpoint a single creature. The shadows stretched impossibly long, moving independently of the moonlight, and every snap of a twig or crunch of snow was echoed back, twisted into distorted, mocking versions of my own steps. I tried to build a fire, hoping to keep the creatures at bay, but the smoke seemed to vanish before it rose, as if the woods swallowed it whole. From the tree line, I glimpsed a figure, tall, thin, partially covered in frost, its head tilting in perfect synchronization with mine. I froze, heart hammering. Its eyes glowed faintly orange, reflecting nothing but the firelight I thought I had made. I realized the creatures weren't just hunting. They were mimicking me, learning me, predicting my movements, studying my fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I could hear them circling, whispering my name in a low, guttural cadence. By the fourth night, exhaustion was setting in. My footsteps no longer left impressions in the snow, as if the forest itself had erased my presence. The howls now echoed my own voice, distorting my words, repeating my fears in guttural tones. Every time I tried to look away, shadows flitted at the edge of my vision, aligning themselves with my gaze, tilting their heads as if mocking me. I stumbled upon a small cave along the riverbank. Inside, it smelled of old blood and something metallic frozen in ice. I dared not enter, but the shadows outside lingered, watching silently, occasionally howling in sequences that seemed almost like instructions or patterns I was meant to follow. My compass spun wildly. No direction felt safe, and every time I thought I saw a path out, it warped behind me, replaced with twisted trees and snowdrifts I didn't recognize. By midnight, I realized the Nick River woods were no longer just inhabited. They were alive, and I was prey-trapped in a living, breathing maze. By the fifth night, the shadows had grown bolder. They no longer stayed at the edges of my vision. One appeared directly in front of me, tall, emaciated, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its fur glistened faintly with frost, and its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. It mimicked my posture perfectly, every movement mirrored, as if I were looking into a grotesque reflection. The howls grew louder, now layered with guttural whispers, repeating my own words before I spoke them. The snow beneath my feet felt soft, almost alive, pulling me toward the tree line where the shadows waited patiently. Every instinct screamed to run, but every path I tried was blocked, twisted, or vanished entirely. I realized then that this forest wasn't hunting blindly. It was teaching fear, learning how to control me before striking, ensuring that I would be trapped mentally as well as physically. By midnight, I understood. Escape would not be easy, and the woods knew it. By the sixth night, hunger and fatigue were overwhelming, but the forest offered no relief. Every step I took was mirrored by shadows, stalking silently yet perfectly synchronized with my movements. The howls weren't random. They now formed a rhythm, circling me, predicting my breathing, my hesitation, and my fear. I stumbled into a shallow clearing where the snow had been scuffed with dozens of footprints, my own, my shadows, and others I didn't recognize. Shapes crouched in the tree line, partially obscured by snow, their elongated limbs swaying, ready to advance at the slightest misstep. I realized I had been followed all along, not by wolves, but by something far older, smarter, and hungrier than any predator I had studied. The creatures weren't just hunting me. They were studying me, cataloging my reactions, and learning how to push me further into despair. By midnight, I had lost all sense of direction, all hope of safety. The Nick River woods weren't just alive. They were sentient, patient, and I was their lesson. By the seventh night, the shadows were no longer subtle. They emerged fully, tall and thin, humanoid yet bestial, moving with deliberate grace. Their glowing eyes reflected the moonlight, and every gesture mirrored my own, as if they were learning me. Every step I tried to take was anticipated, blocked, or twisted by the terrain. Snowdrifts shifted unnaturally, and trees leaned inward, forming tunnels that weren't there before. The howls intensified, now layered with voices that mimicked my own thoughts. They whispered my fears aloud, mocking me, guiding me deeper into the forest. I realized the Nick River woods weren't just hunting me. They were reshaping reality around me, feeding on my terror, bending my perception until I could no longer trust what I saw or heard. I attempted to run, but the shadows flanked me, moving silently through the trees, matching my speed, always blocking exits. The forest was no longer a place of survival. It was a cage, alive and cunning, waiting for me to break. By the eighth night, the woods had become a labyrinth I could no longer navigate. Every turn, every step, every breath was tracked. The howls now carried my own voice, distorted, layered over guttural growls and whispers that I couldn't comprehend. I realized the shadows weren't just tracking me. They were teaching me to fear, amplifying my panic with every movement. I stumbled upon a frozen pond, the surface reflecting multiple versions of myself, elongated and faceless, mimicking my exhaustion and terror. At the edge of the reflection, I saw a humanoid figure emerge from the tree line, perfectly imitating my stance, tilting its head in exact synchronization. The forest wasn't simply alive. It was sentient, responsive, and sadistically patient. Every instinct screamed to escape, but no path led anywhere familiar. The Nick River woods had rewritten themselves entirely, folding space, time, and perception to trap me mentally and physically. I understood then that surviving this place would not depend on skill. It would depend on whether the forest ever allowed me to leave. By the ninth night, exhaustion had dulled my senses, yet fear kept me alert. Every shadow was a potential predator, every howl a coded message I couldn't decipher. The forest had become a mirror of my own terror, twisting reality until I no longer knew where I ended and the woods began. I stumbled through a narrow pass when the snow beneath me gave way, revealing a hidden hollow. Inside, the shadows had gathered, tall, thin, humanoid, their glowing eyes fixed on me. Their elongated limbs swayed in unison, and their howls harmonized with distorted echoes of my own voice, repeating my deepest fears. I realized that these creatures weren't hunting blindly. They were curating my panic, molding the environment to feed my terror, teaching me helplessness before they struck. Each step I took was anticipated, every hesitation noted, and every attempt to flee became part of the lesson. I froze as one shadow stepped forward, perfectly imitating my posture, tilting its head in a way that made my blood run cold. The forest wasn't just alive. It controlled me completely. By the 10th night, I had learned a terrifying truth. The Kinnick River woods didn't merely hunt or mimic. They absorbed presence, cataloging my fear, reshaping reality, and bending perception until I became part of their game. Every step I thought I controlled, every breath I took was anticipated and echoed back at me, distorted and amplified. I found myself at a familiar clearing, yet it was unrecognizable. The pond reflected not just me, but multiple faceless versions, elongated and twisted, swaying in rhythm with the howls. The shadows circled, guiding me toward paths that led nowhere, leading me deeper into disorientation and terror. By dawn, I finally stumbled out of the woods physically alive, but the forest had claimed a part of me. The howls lingered in my mind, faint but persistent, as if the Kinnick River woods were still studying me, waiting for me to return. I left the forest shaken, hollow, forever changed. I survived, but a piece of my soul remained trapped within those sentient, relentless shadows. My name is Avery Collins, and this happened during a winter research trip near Nome, Alaska. I had been documenting remote cabins for a historical survey, curious about structures abandoned decades ago. I thought the solitude would be peaceful, but I was wrong. I discovered a cabin tucked between dense spruce and snow-laden hills. From the outside, it looked intact, almost inviting. The air around it was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. As I approached, a faint sense of being watched prickled my skin. The snow under my boots showed footprints, but none led away from the cabin, as if someone or something had simply vanished. Inside, the cabin was eerily preserved. Dust lay undisturbed. Old furniture stood in perfect order, and a fireplace held ashes still warm, though I was certain no one had been there recently. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, repeating my own name. I turned sharply, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. Yet the air felt thick, alive, and waiting. The first night inside the cabin, I set up my small camp and tried to rationalize the whispers. Perhaps it was the wind, playing tricks on the wooden walls. But as darkness deepened, the whispers grew louder, repeating phrases I hadn't spoken aloud. I explored further, noticing oddities. Furniture slightly shifted, tools out of place, and markings on the floor that hadn't been there before. Every time I moved, I felt a subtle pressure behind me, as if someone or something was just beyond the edge of the light. Around midnight, I heard the door creak open, though no wind stirred and no footprints led to the cabin. A cold draft brushed my neck, carrying the faintest scent of smoke and iron. I turned quickly, flashlight cutting through darkness, but the doorway was empty. By the early hours, I realized the cabin was not merely abandoned. It reacted to my presence, shifting, observing, and perhaps even toying with me. By the third night, I could no longer convince myself the cabin was merely old or haunted by imagination. Every movement I made was mirrored. I would set down my notebook, only to find it moved slightly when I turned back. Chairs shifted imperceptibly. Shadows formed just beyond the edge of my flashlight, twisting into humanoid shapes that froze when I looked directly at them. I noticed faint scratches on the floorboards, thin, deliberate lines forming patterns I could not recognize. The whispers had evolved, now repeating full sentences I hadn't spoken aloud. "You shouldn't be here," they hissed, curling around my thoughts, almost inside my head. I tried leaving, but the door refused to budge. The key I had used to unlock it vanished into thin air, replaced by an icy draft that carried an unnatural chill. It was as if the cabin itself was aware of me, trapping me within its walls. By midnight, panic had replaced curiosity. I wasn't exploring anymore. I was surviving, struggling to escape a place that had taken notice of me and was now refusing to let go. By the fourth night, the cabin's manipulations had escalated. Furniture shifted more aggressively, sometimes appearing hundreds of feet from where it had been. Footsteps echoed in rooms I hadn't entered. The whispers had become taunting, repeating my fears aloud and mocking my attempts to find an exit. I discovered a hidden trapdoor beneath a rug. Heart pounding, I hesitated before lifting it. The crawl space beyond was filled with frozen objects, old journals, tools, and clothing. But they were arranged as if someone had prepared them for me, all pointing toward a shadowed corner where a faint orange glow pulsed. When I approached, the air thickened, and a figure emerged. Tall, faceless, humanoid, partially shrouded in frost, with limbs bending unnaturally. It mimicked my movements perfectly, tilting its head as I did, testing my reactions. By dawn, I understood the truth. The cabin wasn't haunted. It was sentient, cataloging me, learning me, feeding on my terror, and shaping reality so I could never leave untouched. By the fifth night, exhaustion and fear had dulled my senses. But the cabin remained fully aware of me. The whispers had multiplied, layering over one another until I could no longer distinguish my own voice from theirs. Every step I took echoed before I even moved. Every sound I made was distorted and repeated back at me. I tried barricading the door, but the wood shifted on its own, warped, almost breathing, letting the cold draft slip through. The shadow from the crawl space lingered, stretching and elongating, mimicking my posture, predicting my hesitation, and testing my courage. I realized the cabin wasn't trying to harm me outright. It was teaching me fear, feeding off it, prolonging my terror. I attempted to escape through a window, but outside, the snow had shifted into maze-like walls, identical to the interior, reflecting the cabin's sentience. I understood then that I was not merely trapped in a building. I was trapped inside its consciousness, observed and cataloged in real time. By midnight, I accepted that survival would depend on patience, cunning, and avoiding mistakes, though the cabin seemed determined to make both impossible. By the sixth night, the cabin's manipulations had become relentless. The shadows no longer stayed at the edges of my vision. They followed me closely, bending in impossible ways, stretching unnaturally. Every movement I made was mirrored. Every word I whispered repeated back in a distorted tone. I found the trapdoor again and descended cautiously, the icy crawlspace eerily silent except for my own heartbeat. Inside, I discovered items that had belonged to previous explorers, some skeletal, some frozen in strange postures. It seemed the cabin collected those who dared enter, preserving fragments of their lives to create its own history. The faceless shadow appeared once more, stepping slowly toward me, perfectly synchronizing its movement with mine. I felt my fear intensify, the whispers filling my mind with images I didn't want to see. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was alive, intelligent, and hungry for presence. By the early hours, I understood that leaving would not just require strength. It would require outsmarting a sentient building that had studied me for days. By the seventh night, I could no longer distinguish the cabin from its surroundings. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking. The whispers now repeated not just my words, but my memories, distorted and layered with a cold, mocking tone. Every mistake I had ever made was broadcast in that tiny space, amplified by the walls themselves. I attempted to escape through a side door, only to find it led back to the same room I had entered hours ago. The snow outside had shifted again, forming walls, paths, and footprints that disappeared before I could follow them. The cabin wasn't just a building. It was a living trap, learning, adapting, and predicting my every move. The faceless shadow from the crawlspace followed me, sliding silently across the floor, mimicking my posture and motions perfectly. I realized the cabin was feeding on my terror, growing stronger with every fear-induced heartbeat. I had become part of its collection, a specimen for its twisted preservation. By the 8th night, desperation took hold. Every exit led to dead ends, every movement was mirrored, and every sound I made returned warped and mocking. The cabin had become sentient, fully aware of my presence, studying me and manipulating reality around me. I descended into the crawlspace once more, hoping for a hidden path I hadn't discovered. The icy floor reflected multiple faceless versions of myself, each one swaying in rhythm with the whispers. Shadows moved independently, weaving between the frozen objects collected from past intruders, as if orchestrating a chilling performance. I realized then that the cabin didn't merely imprison bodies. It trapped presence and will, reshaping perception so that I could never truly escape. The faceless shadow advanced slowly, perfectly imitating my posture, and I understood with chilling clarity. Leaving alive would not end my torment. The cabin had already claimed a part of me, and it would carry that piece forward into every creak, every shadow, and every whisper. By the 9th night, my sense of reality had fractured completely. The whispers were constant now, filling every corner of my mind, repeating my thoughts before I could even form them. The cabin shifted around me, walls bending, ceilings lowering, and doorways leading to rooms I hadn't entered before. Every step I took was anticipated, mirrored, and twisted by the faceless shadow following me. I found myself back in the main room, staring at the fireplace. The flames were gone, replaced by a pale orange glow that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. On the walls, shadows formed intricate, impossible patterns, reflecting a history of fear the cabin had collected over decades. The faceless figure approached slowly, tilting its head in perfect imitation of my own, and I understood. The cabin didn't just preserve bodies, it absorbed essence, learning who I was and twisting it into something inhuman. By midnight, I knew escape wasn't guaranteed. The cabin had already claimed a part of me, and it would never let it go willingly. By the 10th night, I had pieced together the terrifying truth. The cabin was alive, sentient, and had been collecting the essence of every intruder who dared enter. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper had been designed to break me mentally before I could leave. I stumbled toward what I hoped was the exit. The snow outside now warped into impossible patterns, concealing familiar paths. The faceless shadow followed relentlessly, mirroring my movements exactly, anticipating my choices. I could feel it observing, cataloging, feeding on my fear and exhaustion. Finally, I stepped outside, the crisp Alaskan air hitting my face. The cabin stood silent and still, snow covering its perimeter as if it had never shifted at all. Yet I knew better. Part of me remained inside, trapped in its walls, whispers echoing in my mind. I had survived physically, but the cabin had claimed a piece of my soul, leaving me forever altered. The vanishing cabin of Nome isn't just a structure, it's a predator in plain sight, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to enter. My name is Harper Sinclair, and this happened during a winter research trip to the St. Lawrence Island Lighthouse in Alaska. I had traveled there to document abandoned maritime structures and the legends surrounding them. I thought I was prepared for isolation, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered. The lighthouse stood tall, frozen against the relentless wind, its paint peeling and windows opaque with ice. The surrounding tundra was silent, except for the low howl of the wind across jagged cliffs. The sense of being watched was immediate. Snow crunched under my boots, yet I could have sworn there were footprints moving alongside me, parallel to my own, though no one was there. Inside, the air was thick and cold, smelling faintly of salt and decay. Rusted furniture and equipment lay scattered, as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. Then I heard it, the faintest scraping, echoing through the spiral staircase. I shined my flashlight upward, catching the glint of something moving above. Something that shouldn't have existed. The first night inside, I explored the spiral staircase leading to the lantern room. Each step groaned under my weight, echoing unnaturally through the lighthouse. The wind outside had picked up, howling like a chorus of wailing voices. But the scraping sound above persisted, deliberate, as if something was pacing me. I tried to rationalize it, perhaps a loose metal sheet or a bird trapped in the upper rooms. But every explanation felt hollow. The shadows danced unnaturally across the walls, elongated and twisting in ways that defied physics. As I reached the lantern room, I noticed the glass was not just frosted. It was etched with patterns resembling hands, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The scraping stopped. Silence pressed against my eardrums, almost suffocating. Then a low, guttural moan rolled down the stairs, vibrating through the floorboards beneath me. By the early hours, I realized the lighthouse was no longer just abandoned. It was alive in its own twisted way, observing, testing, and perhaps hunting. By the third night, the lighthouse had revealed its full, oppressive presence. The scraping sounds had multiplied, echoing from every corner, sometimes above, sometimes below, always synchronized with my heartbeat. Shadows stretched along the spiral staircase, bending and twisting unnaturally, never aligning with the light of my flashlight. Every reflection in the icy glass seemed distorted, showing glimpses of something humanoid but impossible, lurking just out of reach. I tried leaving the lantern room, but the door at the base of the stairs refused to open. The handle shifted under my grip, as if alive, resisting my escape. From the dark corners, a low, guttural whisper repeated my name, dragging through the empty walls, vibrating against the metal supports. Then I saw movement in the frozen windows, figures walking across the cliffs, faceless, humanoid, pausing in unison as if acknowledging me. My fear intensified. The lighthouse was no longer a building. It was a predator, feeding on my presence, my panic, and my attempts to flee. By midnight, I realized that survival required more than strength. It required understanding the rules of this living nightmare. By the fourth night, isolation had warped my perception completely. The lighthouse's structure seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The stairs extended further than physically possible, and corners appeared where none had existed before. The scraping sounds were constant now, circling me, moving independently of any natural source. I discovered old logs scattered across the floor, detailing previous lighthouse keepers who had vanished without a trace. Their handwriting was frantic, almost childlike, with repeated warnings. Do not stay. It watches. It learns. My flashlight flickered as I read. Shadows stretching across the room, forming the outline of a humanoid figure with elongated limbs, tilting its head in perfect imitation of mine. Outside, the wind howled, carrying low whispers that were not of this world. The lighthouse itself seemed to pulse, alive with intent, feeding on fear, collecting presence like a living organism. By dawn, I understood that escaping the lighthouse would require outsmarting something older, stronger, and far more cunning than I had ever faced before. By the fifth night, exhaustion had dulled my body, but my senses were sharper than ever. The lighthouse no longer allowed ignorance. It demanded attention. Every creak of the metal railing, every gust of wind through cracks, felt intentional, as if the building itself were testing me. Shadows now moved independently, stretching along walls and ceilings, mirroring my every motion in grotesque exaggeration. I descended the spiral staircase cautiously, flashlight trembling in my hand. At the base, I noticed scratches on the wooden floor, thin, deliberate, forming patterns I could not decipher. The scraping sound returned, now closer, circling me, synchronized with my heartbeat. I realized the lighthouse wasn't merely haunted. It was alive and sentient, cataloging my fear, manipulating my perception, shaping reality to trap me. From the darkness, the faceless figure appeared, limbs bending unnaturally, tilting its head in perfect mimicry. I froze. My fear, amplified by the lighthouse itself, became almost tangible, a presence that pressed against my chest. Every instinct screamed to run, but I understood that this building did not allow ordinary escape. By the sixth night, the lighthouse's influence had escalated further. The wind outside had quieted, leaving only a suffocating stillness. But the interior was alive with movement and sound. The scraping, the whispers, the shadows, all were coordinated, deliberate, and mocking. Every step I took was anticipated, every breath cataloged. I explored the upper lantern room again. The ice covering the glass had shifted, revealing faint faces pressed against the surface, features distorted and frozen in terror. The faceless shadow followed me here too, perfectly mirroring every movement, every tilt of my head. I realized then that the lighthouse absorbed fear and presence, growing stronger with every second I spent inside. I attempted to leave once more, but the door twisted, impossible angles forming, walls elongating. It wasn't just a building, it was a predator, learning, adapting, and keeping me under its control. By midnight, I understood fully. My survival required cunning, courage, and the impossible task of outsmarting a sentient structure that had already decided I was prey. By the seventh night, the lighthouse had fully revealed its malevolent awareness. Every shadow seemed to pulse with intent, bending unnaturally across walls and floors. The faceless humanoid figure followed me everywhere, tilting its head in perfect synchronization, as if studying my reactions to every sound, every movement. The whispers had grown louder, now layering over one another, repeating not just my name, but my memories, my fears, and my regrets. I tried leaving, but the spiral staircase twisted, elongating in impossible directions. Each turn brought me back to the same room, the same frozen glass etched with ghostly faces. The air grew thick and biting, as though the lighthouse itself was breathing, pushing back against my presence, trapping me deeper in its walls. Every instinct screamed to escape, yet every action I took seemed anticipated, mocked, mirrored. The lighthouse wasn't just sentient, it was predatory, feeding off my terror, reshaping reality around me, and cataloging my every emotional response as if it were a specimen under observation. By the eighth night, I had lost all sense of time. The lighthouse had become a labyrinth of impossible geometry. Stairs led to ceilings, corners appeared where none existed, and windows reflected versions of myself that moved independently. The whispers now carried my own thoughts back at me, distorted and mocking, echoing through every creak of the floorboards. I descended toward the base once more, the icy floorboards stretching unnaturally beneath my weight. Shadows moved along the walls in a rhythm all their own, faceless and elongated, bending reality around them. I realized the lighthouse wasn't just haunted, it consumed presence, warping perception, and feeding on fear, adapting continuously. Outside, the frozen cliffs and dark sea seemed impossibly distant, unreachable. The faceless figure mirrored me again, stepping closer with each movement I made. I understood then that leaving alive was only half the challenge. The other half was retaining my sanity against a sentient, predatory structure that had already claimed a piece of me. By the 9th night, I was completely consumed by the lighthouse's presence. The air had thickened, icy and oppressive, pressing against my chest as though the walls themselves were alive. Every step I took was mirrored, every sound I made anticipated, every shadow moving independently. The faceless figure followed silently, tilting its head, observing, studying, as if the building itself had chosen me as its subject. I climbed the spiral staircase one last time, my flashlight trembling. Each step groaned beneath me, echoing unnaturally through the interior. The icy windows reflected multiple versions of myself, elongated, faceless, swaying in rhythm with the whispers. I realized then that the lighthouse collected presence, twisting it into shadows and patterns, preserving the essence of those who entered. By midnight, I understood the horrifying truth. The lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was a predator, living and aware, feeding on the terror of those who dared enter its walls. I was not alone. The shadows, the whispers, and the structure itself had merged into one sentient entity that would not release me willingly. By the 10th night, escape became a desperate struggle against reality itself. The lighthouse shifted and contorted around me, staircases twisting, walls elongating, windows showing impossible vistas of icy cliffs and dark sea. The faceless figure followed relentlessly, perfectly mirroring my every move, and the whispers had grown into a continuous, incomprehensible hum, echoing through my mind. Finally, I stumbled toward the door, forcing it open, and stepped into the freezing night. The wind lashed against my face, the cliffs loomed around me, but the lighthouse behind me seemed unchanged, silent, yet alive, as though waiting. I understood then that leaving the physical structure didn't mean freedom. The lighthouse had claimed a fragment of my essence. A part of my fear and presence would remain trapped forever within its walls. I fled down the snow-laden cliffs, glancing back once. The lighthouse stood unmoving, but I knew better. It watched, waited, and hungered for the next soul who dared trespass. The frozen lighthouse of St. Lawrence Island wasn't merely abandoned. It was eternally alive, patient, and predatory. As the sun rises, or perhaps never fully rises, over the frozen wilderness of Alaska, the stories you've just heard linger in the mind like cold whispers on the wind. From abandoned cabins that trap souls, to faceless shadows in icy lighthouses, each tale reminds us that some places are far more than they seem. They are living nightmares, hidden in isolation, patient and predatory, waiting for the unwary traveler to stumble into their grasp. These were not legends, nor campfire tales. These are real, documented encounters from ordinary people. Accounts of fear so profound that it became part of the landscape itself. From silent, snow-covered villages to structures that bend reality and consume presence. Alaska's remote corners hold secrets that can haunt even the bravest hearts. Remember, the wilderness here is vast, the roads treacherous, and the darkness deep. And in those shadows, you may not be alone. Thanks for watching. This was Dark Fears.